So we're going to switch here now into talking about something fairly different from existentialism and the human condition, though it's all related in the end. So first of all, I want to start this chapter with talking about some different thought experiments that people have used to think about the idea of minds and artificial intelligence. So Alan Turing designed something called the imitation game, which later we started calling the Turing test. You might have seen this movie on this of this title. So the idea is that he came up with was that a human being and a computer both communicate with another human being, who we'll call the tester, in a natural language. So what we mean by natural language is not a symbolic language like logic or programming language. This is a text-only communication. So the tester is not able to see the computer and the other human or communicate with them verbally. It's all text, right? So he called this the imitation game because in his original article, the human, not the tester, but the other human, and the computer were competing with one another to fool the tester into thinking that they were speaking with a human woman. So this was kind of a strange way to do it, but the idea is that both the computer and the human were imitating something else, and they were to fool the tester about their imitation. So most times when people talk about this nowadays, they call it the Turing test, and they simplify it to say that the machine passes the test not if it fools the human into thinking that it's a woman, but rather that it fools the human if it makes them think they're dealing with another human. So if the human can't reliably tell whether they're communicating with the machine versus the other human, then the computer has passed the Turing test. So large language models are systems that are designed to learn statistical relationships between text. So basically what they do is they produce text that is supposed to sort of mimic the way that we use language, that humans use language. And this would seem to give them the ability to pass the Turing test, right? Because the whole idea is that they are sounding like humans. But computer scientists and philosophers have been reluctant to say that these LLMs, large language models, are actually passing the Turing test. It's interesting to see that rather than wanting to say that these LLMs can think, a lot of scientists and philosophers have rather questioned whether the Turing test is adequate to measure intelligence in the right kind of way, because they generally think that these LLMs are not thinking. So they have argued that rather than assessing whether computers are actually thinking, really the test only really measures their ability, these LLMs' ability to fool humans into thinking they're thinking. So there's perhaps a difference between actually thinking and fooling another human being into thinking that it's thinking. So this is interesting because one of the major ethical worries with AI now is the idea that it could be fooling humans into thinking that it is human, and whether they can be used to deceive people in various kinds of ways. We'll discuss this a little bit later. But the question we're concerned right now is can machines think? Why do most computer scientists agree that machines are not actually capable of thinking, and if this is what passing the Turing test means? So we have to talk then about what it means to think. And Turing didn't like to talk about machines thinking, I think because he shared some of the same worries. He tried to say, well, if it passes the Turing test, it's intelligent. So what is the difference then between thinking and intelligence? Perhaps thinking involves something more than just figuring out how two texts are related or producing a set of sentences to answer a question. So this was why John Searle has this thought experiment called the Chinese room. So he imagined himself in a room with a manual in English that gives him instructions on how to respond to sentences that people pass to him on pieces of paper under the door. Now, importantly, John Searle does not know Chinese, so these pieces of paper are entirely in Chinese. The instruction manual is in English, however, but all it really tells him is whether to answer with certain characters if other characters are used. It doesn't give him a definition for the words, so it's not a dictionary, it's just an instruction manual. So if he does this successfully to where the people on the outside of the room think that somebody inside the room understands Chinese, does the room, that is the combination of Searle, who still doesn't know Chinese, and the instruction manual, understand English? And most people want to say it doesn't, that the idea of this room understanding English is strange and wrong. So what Searle wants to argue here is that, look, the room is just a computer. It's like a computer. It's doing what the computer does, which is giving outputs solely based on certain inputs. So if the room doesn't understand Chinese, he says, then neither does a computer, which does the same kind of thing. So these LLMs are doing that same kind of thing, except that their instruction manual is the programming that they've had, and they just follow that programming. Presumably they don't really know what they are doing in a sense. Some philosophers like Ned Block have responded to this by saying, no, the room does understand Chinese, The combination of Searle and the manual is a system, and he says that systems are capable of understanding. So even though Searle himself doesn't learn any Chinese from this whole thing, it doesn't mean that the system that includes him as a part doesn't understand the language. But most people think this is kind of strange. And you might think too, well, okay, LLMs don't just take a piece of paper and push a piece of paper back out. They are taught to use language in a sense. So their training involves things like telling them what would normally come in a series. So if you say, I like, then it might be followed by ice cream or the current president of the United States. But it won't be followed by things that don't make sense. Right? Like you wouldn't say, I like hooray. It just doesn't make sense. Right? So they're taught what comes after what and what a series is and how the language works. They're taught which outputs are better by the trainers. So, for example, in a chat system, you might teach the machine to respond hello to a user coming online or a user saying a similar greeting. So they're taught in a sense, so it's not quite the same, some people want to argue, as Searle and the room. Partly because the things that the LLMs come up with are somewhat new. Like, it's not just a repeat of a sentence. They're actually using language in a sense, and that's part of why people think perhaps they're doing more than the Chinese room. But perhaps being able to come up with responses that are not directly fed into the system, there still seems to be a disanalogy between the way they use language and the way we use language. Just producing correct responses or responses that make sense, even if those responses are not directly programmed in, seems like it's still missing something to us, perhaps. That because the computer can communicate in a similar way using language to the way we seem to communicate using language, or seems to, may not be enough. And they're clearly doing it differently. Like, they are choosing from a number of responses based on their training or their feedback that they have gotten on which response is better. And that's not really the way we use language, it seems. So there does seem to still be something missing to most people. of this question of how are LLMs like or unlike human minds, and are they a different kind of mind, or do they not have minds at all? And so we'll get into this question a bit more as we continue in this chapter.